All right, so this is where we left off. Now, I did record these slides for everybody, so you can obviously watch them online at your leisure, but let's go ahead and kind of talk through things a bit more, and we'll do hopefully a little bit of stuff kind of in breakout rooms as we go. So I am recording. Now, once you have the individuals you're going to work with, the first thing you need to do is really figure out what are the needs of the sport. So we're going to take our knowledge of biomechanics, take our knowledge of exercise physiology. We're going to watch the sport, which muscles are they using, what's going to be the work to rest intervals, what's going to be the intensity, what's going to be the duration. And from there, it's going to give us information as to, okay, like, all right, how do we need to structure their training in order for those folks to be successful? And notice after the energy systems, which makes sense, which is injury prevention. So where do people typically get hurt in the sport? In what way do they typically get hurt in the sport? And if we have this knowledge, we're going to do a better job of programming for them. Because remember, specificity. We want to write the program in a way that's going to help enhance them athletically and allow them to stay on the field. So now, once we know these needs, we're going to work on them through energy systems training, and then obviously typically resistance training, plyometric training. So resistance training, pretty straightforward: concentric, eccentric, and isometric. Concentric is important for the acceleration, eccentric is important for the slowing yourself down, and isometric is important for kind of stabilizing, as well as it's a phase that's going to be in between the eccentric and the concentric. So all of them need to be in the program somewhere. The key is which we need to emphasize. So if we're working with a sprinter, we don't need to worry about the brakes. We just got to worry about having a massive, gas pedal. Whereas if you're working with a football player, you're working with a basketball player, you need that change of direction. So we got to have good brakes. We got to have great handling. And so when we're writing that program, we want to start off with what are the exercises that work on the largest muscle group, simply because they're going to be the most taxing. But that's also when we're going to be the freshest neurologically. We're going to be able to focus the most and do the best. Sorry, my dog drinks incredibly loudly. That's also how he does everything in life. Now, we want to do our multi-joint, high speed, high power, like Olympic lifts, before we're going to do our multi-joint strength lifts, like the squat, deadlift, and the press. And then we're going to go from our multi-joint to our single joint. So that's where we're going to start doing our single joint exercises. Could be some hamstring work, could be some core work, could be some arm work, whatever, what have you. Start with a higher intensity and with a lower intensity. Now, rest periods is laughable. You want to use a rest period that's long enough that your athlete can give you the efforts you're looking for. So if you're working with, say, a cross-country team and you're doing the strength programming for them, well, rest periods can be 5-10 seconds, because they're going to get their breath back pretty fast and be able to go doing repeated bouts pretty darn easily. Whereas when you're working with, say, a 300 plus pound power lifter, you might have to give them 5 to 10 minutes between maximal sets, because it is so metabolically and neurologically stressful for them to do those type of efforts. So the book follows the American College of Sports Medicine recommendations, which are not great for working with real athletes, but it's at least a place to start from. And we'll get more into that as we go forward. So static contractions, these are just doing maximal isometrics, pushing against something that's not going to move. It's really good when you're working with individuals that are coming back from injuries, to help with neurological retraining, and then also to still get some muscle function without putting a lot of stress on the body. However, it's not going to be as good for actual improving real athletic performance. Kind of like my comments when we saw you guys on Monday about the Bosu ball and instability style training, which is great if we're working on neurological reeducation. But unless we're going to play a sport where all of a sudden the floor turns into jello, it's actually not going to be helping us get better at the sport. And if anything, we're going to be actually not as great of an athlete, because we're wasting energy on things that don't actually enhance our performance. If you want a funny story about that, ask me about it in person, and I'll tell you about my first foray into showing out the flaws in Bosu ball style training whenever I was at St. Louis University. So free weights machines, that's a debate that some folks like to have. It really doesn't matter. Free weights are going to be better when it comes to transference to true athletic endeavors, because that's how you're going to move yourself and other objects as a constant resistance. Machines have their place, and they're arguably going to be better when it comes to muscle activation and specifically trying to overload muscles for more of a hypertrophy, trying to look good response. That's where machine training is going to be arguably a slight better approach in those situations. Now, dynamic eccentric training is something that we're going to go down super fast, come back really quickly. This is going to be a way to help improve performance, and we can even do overloaded. So these are maximal eccentric. So you put like 110% of your max and you just control the weight down. The injury risk on that does go up considerably. So risk reward ratios can get to be not exactly great, but it's going to be one of those things where we should always have an eccentric component, have a concentric component. Both are going to be important for, especially the eccentric, arguably for more muscular damage for hypertrophy, though concentric is important too. And the concentric is going to be probably the more important part when it comes to actual strength performance, because you're learning how to lift the object. Lowering the object is fine, and that's a skill in and of itself, but making sure that we have both sides of the contraction as well as the isometric in between. Variable resistance training is simply going to be where there's cams and different types of levers that's going to change the load you're going to be lifting as you go through range of motion. This is what you see in machines that have cables, and you'll see how there's kind of, it's an oblong disc like that we have over in the Weaver gym. And that's where you're going to have parts of the movement that are going to be a bit easier, usually the bottom where you're weakest, and then the top where you're going to have the greatest load, which is typically also where you're strongest. So that typically is a good approach if we're, once again, trying to just work towards hypertrophy. Isokinetic is simply doing training that's the same speed. So no matter how hard you push, it's only going to allow you to go at a certain rate. This can be a way to help with neurological re-education. You typically would see this single joint. I've done this before on pressing, pulling, and squatting, and they are miserable. I would thoroughly suggest not doing them, but like anything else, it's maybe an adjunctive training exercise you could do in certain situations. Now, plyometrics, this is going to be not just jumping, this can be throwing medicine balls and otherwise. Great method to utilize the stretch shortening cycle. So we're talking about muscle spindle function, Golgi tendon organ inhibition, and improving neurological parameters for getting individuals to move at a greater rate of speed. Yeah, be careful with the volume here. It's also one of those where you can have a greater increased risk of injury just because you're moving things really quickly if we're doing too much volume and we happen to not be doing a lot of we haven't done a lot of foundational work. We don't have good movement patterns. Now, we think of Olympic lifting, which is going to be a rate of force development tool, just like plyometrics. It's a very complex one. Olympic lifting is great. It just happens to have a decent risk of injury as well as a lot of complexity. So it's pretty easy to teach somebody how to do a medicine ball, chest pass, how to do a box jump, but teaching someone how to do a snatch and a clean can take a lifetime. Now, using E-stim as a way to get muscles to fire, so we're just skipping the nervous system and just cranking or hooking up to a pair of jumper cables and then just yourself until you move. That is something you can do. It's usually more for rehabilitation than it is for true maximal performance. Russian models of Russian stim, which hurts like an MFer because you have to put enough voltage through someone in order to get it to contract. It's not going to be something you typically want to do a sustainable training program. If any of you guys want to try it out sometime, don't. But we can talk about that also in person if you guys have questions about how E-stim can work. Now, core stability, like anything else, can get a little overblown, and everyone thinks, not everyone, speaking in that type of language can be very flawed, to say the least. Any point that you don't have enough strength in order to perform the movement you're looking for is going to be a point at which you have what's known as a force leakage, okay? Wherever we have any instability, we're not going to be able to produce as much force. Our neurological system down regulates us whenever we don't have the strength going from one side to the other. So what this means is your body, if you're walking on, say, a tree branch and the tree branch is shaking really hard, your body's not going to let you kick as hard into that as you can. It's telling you neurologically, don't freaking do it because I'm on an unstable surface and I'm not able to recruit those biggest, most powerful motor units. So it's where we talk about instability training is not a great way to work with real athletes because you're not actually allowing them to utilize all of their musculature. So if someone happens to have a weak core, so they throw a punch and they can't actually turn through their shoulders or just to maintain the turn that they're getting through their hips, we're going to be losing force that otherwise we would have had. Same thing, pitching a baseball, swinging a baseball bat, anything that's going to require force to be transmitted from the feet to the hands and vice versa. We can see the use for it because you literally have a slinky that's connecting essentially your hips to your thoracic, essentially to your rib cage. And the stronger that is, the better we're going to have for that force production. Now, there's a number of different ways you can go to help increase core strength and stability. Also, typically, if we have stronger hip musculature, we've got stronger scapular stabilizers. That's also going to help enhance an athletics performance. Now, definitely a potential to increase or to decrease the risk of injury simply because we are going to be able to hold our position and not be cranked over and rotated, put into a high degree of flexion. Like anything else, if we do a better job of holding those positions, we're typically going to be able to fire the rest of our muscles a bit harder. And your core musculature happens to be typically very type 1. So it tends to respond well to high repetitions. Unlike your other fiber types, especially things like triceps and hamstrings and gastroc, that are very type 2, that do very well in low repetition. So, energy systems training. We want to train our energy systems to be either A, good at the sport for what we need, or B, be able to survive practice for said sport. So a number of sports practices are much higher pace, much more energy system demanding than the sport itself. Baseball, softball, football are great examples of it. Other sports, soccer, basketball, we need to train an athlete so they're able to go out there and perform their role on the field. So your duration, your intensity, all of this should always be linked to what we're asking our athlete to do in their given sport. So if we think about that ATP PCR system, lasts for about 3 to 15 seconds, usually about 5. We're only going to be getting ourselves through indoor track distances. We're talking doing a 40-yard, doing a 40 for NFL combine things, not even going to make you the full 60, but you're just only tapping slightly in anaerobic glycolysis. So it's not a big issue. Whereas if we're going to go and play soccer, basketball, we're going to have periods of time on the field where we're going to be potentially sprinting for over 10 seconds and then jogging back. And so we're going to talk about oscillating between 2 different intensities and how we're going to help develop that aerobic base to help then restore and effectively bring that pH back up and help bring out some of that wonderful lactate and utilize it as fuel source. This is ACSM's recommendation for resistance training programs. I don't think it's good at all, but it's something that you guys should just understand so that we can work forward from it and come up with some better approaches. So the sheer idea that you're going to have someone do strength development and you're going to somehow get 80% of your max for a set of 12 is hilarious. The amount of drugs you'd have to have that person hopped up on to be able to give you that type of output, or they'd be a very type 1 individual or a combination of the two, not something that you're going to really run into too often. Instead, strength development typically is going to be doing the best when we're working in certain rep and load ranges. And that's why I like this. It's from the NSCA, where effectively you can see, depending on, now if we look at the top, you see the rep number going across. That's like RM. So 2 RM, 3 RM, 4, all the way up to 20 RM. So we're talking about those sets are going to be freaking hard. Okay. And we can see how we go from emphasizing strength and power in our lower repetition range, so 5 and below. Once we get over into the 6 to 12, that's where we're going to see we're still building strength and power, but nowhere near as much, but we're definitely focusing on hypertrophy. And then once we're going over that, now we're getting hard into muscular endurance, maybe a little bit of hypertrophy as well, and strength and power nowhere near as much. So you can kind of see in that continuum where you're going to find emphasis on different components. And so this can be based on different muscle groups, different movements that we're going to have individuals doing. Now, the bottom center is what's known as the Prilipin chart. Now, this is from A.S. Prilipin. He was a statistician for the USSR and effectively looked at all of the total volume that Olympic lifters were doing in the 1960s to figure out who made the most progress. And what they found was with the Olympic lifts. So at that point, it had been clean and jerk, clean and press, and the snatch. is they found there typically was an optimal number of sets and reps these athletes would do in a given training session. So you see the reps, you see the percentage ranges, you see the reps they perform per sets, followed by the optimal number, which is usually somewhere in the middle of the total range. So we're looking to just get in an adequate amount of volume in certain cases. So if we're talking like an in-season athlete, an athlete that's training a number of times per week, or optimal like most times of the year, or there's certain periods of time where we're trying to go in the upper end of the range because we're doing a whole lot of volume, because we're in a real far into the off season, and we're just trying to build that base of work capacity. So you can get an idea of effectively how many reps per set we're really looking at in different percentage ranges depending on our goals. And we see how, notice guys, the highest we're going to is 6 when we're talking about for developing an athlete when it comes to maximal strength and power. So not that you're not getting a little bit of strength from doing sets of 10 in certain movements, but sets of 10 in certain movements get to be incredibly dangerous. Meaning, I'm not worried about you guys doing a set of 10 in the bench press, deadlift, or squat once you know how to do the movement. But doing a set of 10 in things like snatches and clean and jerks, because they're so high coordination, high focus movements, you're more likely to potentially make errors and potentially hurt yourself, especially when the loads get to be very heavy. So interval training is simply going to have bouts of going really hard and bouts of doing nothing or giving yourself a little bit of rest. This is a good way in order so that we can go ahead and just develop our total amount of work capacity. Now the volume, get an idea of how much actual running, the distances they're going to run, and then how much rest they're going to get between each of those. So if we look at soccer, midfielders on high levels of the sport can easily run almost a half marathon over the course of a 90-minute game. So we've got to have a heck of an aerobic battery and still be able to sprint inside of it. Whereas if you think about something like football, it would be an incredible day for a rusher to make well over 100 yards. Now, mind you, they're starting behind the line of scrimmage. So there are going to be, and they're starting from a negative each time. But a running back arguably is probably not going to sprint more than 400 total meters over the course of a game. And even then, maybe 800 meters, so half a mile. So we don't need to do as much volume, but that intensity is incredibly high. So we want to make sure that we are keeping this in mind when it comes to the number of sets we're doing, okay, the number of repetitions. So if we want to think about the football analogy, because I think it's a relatively easy one, the team's only going to be on the field for so long on offense, and then they're either going to score or they're not. And if at some point special teams is going to come on, the defense can be on. So that would be effectively how many reps we do per set. Then we do multiple sets because in theory, they're going to have multiple drives during the game. Okay. And then we can figure out, once again, what's the distance. We can have oscillations that go a little longer, a little bit shorter in distances sometimes. And then how frequently we're going to have them do this. So the higher frequency we're doing, typically the better response we're going to have with aerobic style training. But like anything else, there's only so much the human body can recover from. So we want to give enough stress to the individuals, but we're not trying to just beat people down because we can. Now, we can utilize this for just about any sport. So we've got a basic framework we're going to work from here, which is, okay, what's our mode? So if I'm going to be swimming, if I'm playing water polo, I'm swimming. That's going to be my form of conditioning. If I'm playing soccer, okay, my conditioning form is going to be running because that's how I go. If I'm playing wheelchair basketball, it's going to be riding around in a wheelchair because that's how you move. Now, rate of the exercise intensity or interval. So how hard are we going? What's the sport going to really look at? How far are we going to go? Running 400 meters for soccer might be useful. For football, that sounds insane, especially when you look at linemen. They're never going to go that far. So when we're thinking about the distance, okay, what's going on? Number of reps, what type of recovery are we going to have? So if it's football, okay, are we giving ourselves where we essentially finish the play, jog or walk to the huddle, chat for a couple seconds, jog, walk back to our position and go? Or is it something like soccer where we're going to sprint and then still have to jog back in position and move around? So hence the duration of that active recovery and the type of activity during that active recovery. And frequency, again, usually starting at least twice per week. We can easily get that up over 5 or 6 times a week, depending on who we're working with. Now, When we're working with individuals, we can look at it as percentage of the heart rate max, which is great. And that's when we do things like the VO2 max that you guys are going to see on Friday. We're going to see, okay, what would be the intensities we want to have this individual train at, depending on which parts of the energy systems we're going to focus on, as well as, are we working on anaerobic tolerance? Are we working on our ability to clear lactate? Are we working on our ability to just develop an aerobic base? Are essentially the peak of our fat metabolism? How hard are we going to have people work in different situations? And then obviously intensity, how fit is someone in the first place, we should keep in mind. And then from there, how hard are we going to be working is going to give us an idea of what percentage we're at. And that can be really hard to do, folks, because it's easy for folks to over and underestimate how difficult they think things are with their own training. Now, heart rate is a great indicator of how stressful things are. If we can have heart rate monitors on people when they're working out, that's great, because we're going to get information as to how hard is their body perceiving this. Now, it's also perceiving the stress of the situation, meaning is this a high pressure situation for a sport, as well as it is going to be the physiological stress of the requirements from cardiac output between thermal regulation and energy production. So if we got an idea what somebody's heart rate is going to look like, now we have an idea of how well they're training, and we can even do some other things with heart rate, which we're going to talk about in a few, to help enhance their performance. So go figure, folks. The distance of the interval is going to effectively be related to the sport that we're having them do, and also which energy system we're focusing on. So notice, guys, for that ATP PCR focus, I wouldn't even say the 5 by 200 meters. I would do something more like a 20, 20 by 50 meters. So we're really just blasting hard and recovering. Whereas if we're going to go hard anaerobic glycolytic, that can be running a 400 meter, 200 to 800 meters, going to really focus hard on that, depending on how fast somebody is. And then if we're going aerobic oxidative, that's where you see the repeats of individuals going. So you don't even see that high of a lactate response for the folks that are doing the 5 by 2 mile run with a 15-second rest, because it turns out they're not utilizing and emphasizing the energy system. But notice the ATP PCR, their lactate response is even more robust than the folks that are running the 5 by 400. Either way, absolutely miserable, and I would not want to do that training ever. Any of those. Well, if you guys want to try it sometime, we can try it. By the way, we have lactate strips now, so we can even see a response if you want to really hate your life. So reps and sets per session, going to depend heavily on the sport. So if we're going to be doing something that happens to be real quick, maximal burst, take a recovery, more reps and sets, real short intervals, throwers, Olympic lifters, etc. Whereas if we're going to do really long distances, like we are a person who's running a marathon, 10, 15K, anything along those lines, we don't need to do a whole lot of reps and sets. We just are going to be doing a huge amount of volume. And that's also going to be, when we're looking at athletes in that rest interval, one thing that can be really useful when you're working with folks in general is basing the interval on their heart rate. So once their heart rate gets to a certain level, we have them go in and do their next set. Now we could base it on how they feel, what their breathing rate is like, and gives us information like, okay, how well recovered is this person? Are they ready to go ahead and do another bout? And are they going to be able to give us good effort? Now, this is great because you can have people that are in really good aerobic condition recover really quickly. So if we want to have a conditioning effect for them, they got to go out and do their next bout immediately. Whereas if we're working with someone that's not as well aerobically conditioned, it's going to take them a long time to recover, which is fine because it was metabolically stressful. And they're not going to be overstressing their body by not getting adequate recovery between each set. It requires more technology, but it's going to give you better information than just everybody steps on the line and everybody does the sprint at the same time. So higher intensity, the lower our recovery intensity should be, the more fit we are, the higher the intensity can be, and the smaller rest we're going to need. And like anything else, what we're doing for our active recovery is going to depend on how good a condition we're in. So it's going to go from just standing there or laying on the ground to slowly walking around to walking and or a light jog if we're really working with a high level athlete. And then same thing with a swimming option. You can also have them tread water, which is something you do a lot in water polo. Trust me. It's miserable, but you got that or drown. So you choose to typically tread. Now, Frequency is going to come down to the individuals we're working with. What are their demands? So if our goal is to be an aerobic athlete, we'd probably be doing this most days of the week, meaning 5, if not 7, probably should give yourself at least 1 rest day a week just for sanity and to recover. Now, depending on swimmers, which are more like sprinters, and when it comes to the duration, we're talking about the interval training. And then if we're talking about being team sport athletes, if we're getting a good aerobic component as part of the training, so we're playing live soccer games, scrimmages, same thing with basketball, probably don't have to have a whole lot of extra conditioning. Whereas if we're an off season or even in season, softball player, baseball player, we want to make sure that we're still keeping that conditioning component inside of their athletic development so that we're not going to have athletes falling off and getting deconditioned during the year. So the next wonderful drug is continuous training, which is we're just not taking breaks. We're just going the entire time. This is typically going to be referred to as long, slow distance, LSD, which is a way to train individuals. It's good to build an aerobic base. It's also good to help improve movement economy, as well as it's just going to help in, well, if you don't do too much work to where you hurt yourself, it's going to help really thicken up your tendons and ligaments to deal with the sheer amount of volume of work that you're having people doing. So it has its time and a place. It just typically is very boring. And that's why there's a lot of people that prefer not to do it. And like anything else, when we're talking about this, we're talking about covering a set distance. We're not talking about just going for a set speed. So yes, it's not as stressful as if we were just going and doing like a time trial. However, it is something that's going to be metabolically stressful because we're going to be chewing through a whole lot of our stored nutrients, as well as it's going to be psychologically challenging if we've got to go out there for hours at a time. But certain sports and activities are going to require incredibly long durations. Now, fartlek training is a really fun kind of form of interval training with continuous training, in that we're going to go ahead and go and do kind of a walk, jog, sprint, or jog, run, sprint, where we're going to oscillate between different intensities. It just gives us different options, as well as we can do different types of directions, which is really useful. And then there's just your good old circuit training. So we could run down to one station, perform an exercise, run down the other. Tempo style training otherwise is a good example of this. If you guys want to try it sometime on the field, I'd be more than happy to go ahead and give it a shot with you guys. It's just a good overall conditioning effect, but it still gives you some variability, so you're not going to be just losing your mind, banging your head up against the wall. So now we don't have a whole lot of you guys, so we're just going to go ahead and do 2 groups today. So what we're going to have is group 1. You guys are in charge of looking at, if you guys can read this scenario, and I'll go ahead and copy and paste it in the chat so you guys can see that as well. But effectively, you guys are going to be working with an athlete that is going to be a power lifter, group 2. You've got an ultra marathoner. And so with the 5 basic principles of training, okay, you're going to start with somebody that's already in shape. So they're physically fit. Just say that they're like a CrossFitter, like, you know, they're okay at a lot of things, but they're not great at anything. So from there, our goal is to make them be a super high level power lifter or super high level ultra marathoner. How are we going to incorporate individuality, specificity, progression, reversibility, obviously, to a certain extent, as well as variation in the program? So we're going to be able to get them to get to whatever level we're looking for. So it's 2:06 right now. I'll give you 5 minutes. So at 2:11, we're going to come back and you guys will be able to present how you're going to make sure you incorporate all 5 of those basic principles. See you guys in a few.